141. 6. The Road to Nowhere is chapter will discuss the process leading to the PA's establishment and the marginalization of the liberation movement in favor of the Trump-Netanyahu deal to be discussed in Part 2. It will also include some concluding remarks for Part 1. EPLO's most significant achievement was creating a political body that represents the Palestinian people as a collective. The PLO was the organized expression of the Palestinian entity and entitativity. Against all odds, it was also able to achieve several successes in the international sphere, from formal recognition of the PLO by more countries than had diplomatic relations with Israel at one point, to major UN resolutions in support of the Palestinian people and their cause, to admission to the UN as a non-member observer. Table 6.1 lists important resolutions that strengthened Palestinian entitativity over time. The achievements of the RST Intifada are not easy to evaluate. Why? It forced the Palestinian issue on the international public and official agenda and redrew the image of Israel, paying paid to notion of a victim and driving home its nature as an occupation power that maltreats the occupied people under its authority. The Israeli army was turned into a riot police to suppress civil protests, split Israeli society. During the RST Intifada and severely reduced public morale. Table 6.1 UN resolutions re-acting PLO achievements related to Palestinian entitativity. Item resolution number organ date. The Palestinian people's right to self-determination is recognized. 2672 General Assembly, the 8th of December 1970. EPLO is invited to participate in General Assembly debates. 3210 General Assembly, the 14th of October 1974. The inalienable rights of the Palestinian people in Palestine are reaffirmed. 3236 General Assembly, the 22nd of November 1974. EPLO is granted observer status. 3237 General Assembly, the 22nd of November 1974. Zionism is determined a form of racism. 3379 General Assembly, the 10th of November 1975. EPLO is invited to participate in efforts to achieve peace in the 3375 General Assembly, the 10th of November 1975. 142. Middle East. Settlements are determined to have no legal validity, and a commission is established to examine the situation relating to the settlements. For 46 Security Council, the 22nd of March 1979. Israel is called upon to dismantle existing settlements and to cease the construction and planning of settlements. Its resolution was passed unanimously. 465 Security Council, the 1st of March 1980. The Palestinian people's right to self-determination is supported. 3858 General Assembly, the 13th of December 1983. It is reaffirmed that the permanent observer mission of the PLO to the United Nations is covered by the provisions of the agreement between the United Nations and the United States of America regarding the headquarters of the United Nations. 42-229 General Assembly, the 12th of March 1988. EPLO is deemed entitled to have its communications circulated as official documents. 43-160 General Assembly, the 9th of December 1988. It is decided that the designation Palestine should be used instead of Palestine Liberation Organization in the United Nations system. 43-177 General Assembly, the 15th of December 1988. It is reaffirmed that illegal Israeli actions in the occupied territories cannot be recognized. ES 10-3 General Assembly, the 15th of July 1997. Palestine is accorded the status of non-member observer state in the United Nations. 67 19th General Assembly, the 29th of November 2012. It is decided that the Acts of 69 320 General, the 10th of September 2015. 143. Non-member observer states at the United Nations, including the Palestinian AG, shall be raised at headquarters and United Nations offices. Assembly. Source: prepared by the researcher or consulting the United Nations General Assembly and Security Council resolutions on Palestine. Only some of the damage it caused to the Israeli macroeconomy during the RST Intifada, 1987–93, will be detailed here. Palestinians carried out several forms of economic resistance activities, including strikes, boycotts of Israeli goods and refusal to pay taxes to military occupation authorities. A high percentage of Palestinian workers from the occupied territories who worked on settlements in the territories or in Israel itself, in construction, agriculture, and factories among other sectors, did not report to work for many reasons, from the general strikes to the curfews. Israeli employers suffered a severe manpower shortage as a result. To compensate for loss of income, the Palestinians revived self-sustenance projects and relied on household economies. Although the economy of the Palestinians in the occupied territories was adversely affected, the main aim was to raise the cost of Israeli occupation. As economic studies show, the Intifada cost Israel millions of dollars a day in increased military expenditure, a decline in investments, losses in trade, increased unemployment, a decrease of the purchasing power of Israelis, and a drop in tourism. Labor-intensive agricultural and construction sectors were the hardest hit. Israeli sources' estimates of the damage to Israel's economy as a result of the Intifada varied, depending on the source, with some trying to underplay their damage to others that assessed it as traumatic. According to World Bank data, unemployment rates almost doubled from 6.33% in 1985 to 12.24% in 1990, then increased further to a high of 14.08% in 1992. Foreign direct investment, FDI, rate declined from 0.55% to 0.25% of GDP in 1987 to 90. Israel's annual GDP per capita growth plunged from 5.42% in 1987 to 1.22% and 1.12% in 1988 and 1989, respectively. In 1990 to 3, the GDP per capita growth rate fluctuated sharply, with a high of 4.1% in 1992 and a low of 1.39% in 1993. For a similar trend applies to Israel's GDP growth rate, gross national income, GNI, growth rate 144, and GNI per capita growth rate in the same period. A slight increase in growth was partially attributed to the large waves of Jewish immigration to Israel at the time, mainly from the former Soviet Union, which contributed to the housing boom and stimulated Israeli economic activity. The total number of Jewish immigrants from the former Soviet Union to Israel increased from 12,900 immigrants in 1989 to 185,200 in 1990 and 147,800 in 1991. However, their economic boom created by greater immigration was only temporary and accompanied with strong innovation in both Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. 72nd Intifada, 2000–3, erupted in a year of high economic growth in Israel. According to the data, the Second Intifada, like the RST, exacted a high toll on the Israeli economy, billions of dollars of additional security spending, declining investment rates, a drop in tourism and high unemployment. Unemployment in 2003 climbed to 13.51%, the second highest rate since 1969, the earliest official data available. A highest recorded rate was in 1992 or the RST Intifada. 8 a significant increase in FDI rates in the years characterized by rising hopes for peace or the Oslo Accords, from 1.5% in 1998 to 6.08% in 2000. FDI rates plummeted to lows of 1.35% in 2001 and 1.31% in 2002. 9 Israel's GDP growth rates declined from 7.46% in 2000 to only 0.12% and minus 0.01% in 2001 and 2002. 10 Israel's GDP per capita growth rate, GNI growth rate and GNI per capita growth rate experienced the same downward trend in the same period. 11 Bank of Israel described the 2 years following the breakout of the Second Intifada as the longest in Israel's history due to their heavy economic recession. 12 Signing the Oslo Accords, 1993-5, especially the 1994 Economic Protocol, the Paris Protocol, beneath the Israeli economy, which witnessed a renewed growth, increasing rates of GDP growth, GDP per capita growth, GNI growth, GNI per capita growth and FDI, and a drop in unemployment rates to 8.46% by 1996, 13 despite the Paris Protocol's declared aim of boosting Palestinian economic growth, improvements were, of course, less felt by the Palestinians. In the years following Oslo, the Palestinian economy still struggled due, on the one hand, to its structure and its subordinate relationships with the occupying power and with international aid and, on the other, to its chronically dysfunctional and unproductive public sector, which is dependent on the political objectives of international donors and Israeli domestic politics. 14 ERST Intifada, which sustained several years of broad and organized grassroots resistance that included numerous acts of civil disobedience, certainly did. 145. Not fail. But it gradually subsided against the backdrop of massive geopolitical stress that shook the world. Most far-reaching changes were the overhaul of the international order that followed with the breakup of the Soviet Union and the collapse of its global system and the collapse of the Arab order, within which the PLO had nourished, the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. Figure 6.1 Israel's GDP growth, annual percent. 1986 to 2005. Source: World Bank National Accounts Data and OECD National Accounts Data Les. Figure 6.2 Israel's GDP per capita growth, annual percent. 1986 to 2005. Source: World Bank National Accounts Data and OECD National Accounts Data Les. It was precisely because of the RST uprising's civil character, which had riveted international attention, that former President George H.W. Bush Sr. was compelled to address the Palestinian issue when he called on the Arab world to join an alliance against Iraq and lend Arab legitimacy to a war to liberate Kuwait. A Madrid Peace Conference was held in 1991, just after the Kuwait War, and was ended by representatives of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip as part of a joint Palestinian 146 Jordanian delegation, which insisted on the PLO being the formal representative of the Palestinian people. It should be stressed that it was the Intifada that enabled the reinstatement of the PLO nearly a decade after the organization had been driven from Lebanon and sidelined. Figure 6.3 Israel's foreign direct investment, FDI, net in-house, percent of GDP, 1986 to 2005. Source: World Bank National Accounts Data and OECD National Accounts Data Les. Figure 6.4 Israel's foreign direct investment, FDI, net in-house, percent of GDP, 1986 to 2005. Source: International Monetary Fund, International Financial Statistics and Balance of Payments Database, World Bank, International Debt Statistics, and World Bank and OECD GDP estimates. Israel would not have long to celebrate its success in removing the PLO from Lebanon in 1982. Ayred's failure to translate its military conquest into a separate peace agreement with Beirut, it found itself facing a grueling war of attrition with the Lebanese resistance against the Israeli occupation of South Lebanon. Largely due to failures of Likud governments in Lebanon, the Israeli Labour Party returned to power in 1984. Labour's comeback was also partially due to a political coalition deal with the Likud, a deal that did not change the steady rightward tree of Israeli society. 147. Since the 1967 war and Likud's 1977 electoral victory, which had ended Labour's uninterrupted streak as Israel's ruling party since the establishment of the state. Figure 6.5 Unemployment rates in Israel 1983 to 2005, % of total labor force, national estimates. Source: World Bank, International Labour Organization, Illstat database. Under the premiership of Yitzhak Rabin, 1992-5, the Labour Party reached the conclusion that the existing strategy of violent suppression was futile. It realized that it had to deal with the Intifada politically, which meant that it needed to negotiate with the representatives of the Palestinians even if they were supporters of the PLO. Yasser Arafat, for his part, agreed to this formula and allowed a delegation from the occupied territories to negotiate with an Israeli delegation under PLO supervision, but insisted that the PLO, rather than that delegation, should be the signatory to any agreement with Israel. PLO leadership bypassed that track and reached an agreement with Israel in Oslo, a declaration of principles that included not even one principle of a solution to the Palestinian issue, an agreement that the delegation from the occupied territories would have never agreed to. A difference is that the PLO was ready to pay a price for Israeli recognition and accept anything that included such a recognition, because it would save it from the political wilderness it found itself in, or the collapse of the socialist bloc and of the Arab order, or the occupation of Kuwait. It was a grave mistake. A declaration of principles included mutual recognition, procedures, and establishment of a Palestinian authority, but no solution, not even principles of a possible solution. 15. The practical effect of the Oslo Accords was to reduce the PLO to a constituent body of the PA under Israeli sovereignty whose main function is to safeguard Israeli security. Before this, the PLO committed another error, which was to insist on the dissolution of the joint Palestinian-Jordanian delegation, or the Madrid Peace. 148. Negotiations. It was not in the interest of the Palestinian people either. Rather, it served the PLO leadership, which had invested in and committed to the issue of representation out of the belief that this was the only way to ensure its political survival. A dissolution allowed Jordan to sign a separate peace treaty with Israel in 1994 without reclaiming the land Israel seized in the 1967 war. A responsibility for this now fell squarely on the PLO. A Jordanian leadership maintained direct secret talks with Israel for a long time, 16, but it could never sign an agreement before the Palestinians did. If the PLO and Jordan had continued to negotiate jointly, neither of them would have dared sign a peace treaty without RST regaining East Jerusalem. As discussed and argued in the previous chapter, this approach gave rise to the term Palestinian-Israeli Connectivity, which did not exist prior to the Oslo Agreement. International organizations and the Western media had until then used the term Arab-Israeli Connectivity, while the Arab world used the term Palestinian Course, which, in turn, was viewed as an Arab course. There had been no such thing as a Palestinian-Israeli Connectivity, as if the two sides were both countries or symmetrical sides and on equal footing. The Oslo Accords initiated a peace process that aimed to achieve a negotiated treaty between Israel and the PLO based on UN Security Council Resolutions 242 and 338, but without RST reaching an agreement on the interpretation of these. Resolutions. The Oslo I Accord, officially called the Declaration of Principles on Interim Self-Government Arrangements or Declaration of Principles, was reached through secret negotiations in Norway and signed in 1993 in Washington, D.C. It was preceded by letters of mutual recognition, according to which the signatories accepted each other as a partner of negotiation. Thus, the PLO recognized the State of Israel, while Israel recognized the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people. The agreement postponed discussion of the most difficult issues between both parties to their null status negotiations. The deferred issues are for the status of Jerusalem, the fate of Palestinian refugees, the Jewish settlements in the occupied territories, and the establishment of the Palestinian state and its borders. The agreement, called Oslo I, codified the results of the Oslo negotiations and laid out a three-phase plan towards peace. The first phase called for the withdrawal of Israeli forces from the Gaza Strip and Jericho in the framework of a special schedule that kept Israel responsible for the external security and internal security of Israeli settlers in these areas. On the 29th of April 1994, the Protocol on Economic Relations, Paris Protocol, was signed between Israel and the PLO. It reconstituted economic and trade relations between Israel and the PA in a way that tied the Palestinian economy to Israel. In Cairo in May 1994, an agreement was signed regarding the West Bank and Jericho, regulating Israel's partial withdrawal. 149. From the Gaza Strip and the city of Jericho in the West Bank and the transfer of local authority to the PA. A second phase was inaugurated in 1995 with the interim agreement on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Oslo II, as it was called although it was signed in the Egyptian resort of Tarbes, provided for the gradual redeployment of Israeli forces in the West Bank and transfer of certain powers to the PA. Israeli withdrawal from the designated parts of the West Bank was to be completed at least 22 days before the eve of the Palestinian National Council elections. Redeployment was to be carried out in phases, the RST phase of which covered populated areas. The West Bank, as a whole, was split into three administrative areas. Areas A, B and C each accorded a different status. Area A, approximate 18% of the total territory of the West Bank, would be exclusively administered by the Palestinian National Authority. Area B, approximate 22% of the total territory of the West Bank, would be jointly administered by the PA and Israel, whereby the PA governs civilian life, but Israel controls security. In Area C, approximate 60% of the total territory of the West Bank, both civil and security affairs are administered by Israel. Oslo II denied the basic terms for the transfer of authority from Israel to the Palestinians, as well as the powers that Israel retains under this agreement. Finally, Oslo II was to culminate in a permanent status agreement, bringing an end to the interim phase on the 4th of May 1999. As we know, that never happened. Their taxonomy of areas A, B and C became a permanent status issue, and the Israeli building of settlements continued to change the character of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. In May 1997, the Hebron Protocol was signed as a prelude to the beginning of permanent status talks. The protocol divided Hebron into Area H1, about 80%, which would come under Palestinian control, and Area H2, where Israeli settlers reside, which would remain under Israeli control. Since then, Hebron has become a vivid illustration of the Israeli apartheid system produced are the Oslo agreements. Finally, the White River Memorandum of October 1998 was signed to help both parties continue to fulfill their obligations under previous treaties with the goal of reaching a null status. The Israeli government of Ehud Barak, elected in 1999, did not implement the agreed-upon redeployments, preferring instead to unilaterally dictate his terms for a permanent status agreement. RST Camp David II, 2000, was arranged for this purpose. EAMT back red, precipitating renewed confrontation in the Second Intifada. Ayer Oslo Yitzhak Rabin realized that the alternative to the PLO was a growing Hamas. He thought that he would be able to rescue the PLO and bring it back to the international arena through an agreement involving the only concession he ever intended to make, recognizing the PLO. In exchange, the Intifada would stop there. 150. PLO would recognize Israel and agree to negotiate without any clear shared principles concerning a just solution, and it would become a partner in maintaining order and fighting terrorism in the occupied territories. CONICT would thus end and negotiations would continue until an agreement was reached. This is why the Oslo Declaration of Principles and the subsequent Cairo agreements had deferred any solution of the so-called permanent status issues into which the Palestinian cause was split. Not only was there no consensus on these points per se, but nor was there a consensus on the baseline principles and foundations for resolving these issues. Therefore, autonomy under a new Palestinian authority was proposed as an interim solution. It was convenient for Israel. It absolved the occupying power of its civil responsibilities towards the local population, creating a luxurious situation for the occupiers, an occupation with costs that numerous Israeli commentators have called deluxe occupation, while requiring the PLO wield its authority on behalf of Israel's security interests in the name of counter-terrorist security coordination. It was how the PLO was practically marginalized from the moment it was formally recognized. Not only did it become an authority without a state, but it became hostage to the Israeli occupation. After being rescued by the Oslo Accords, the PLO was soon eclipsed by the institutionalization of a Palestinian national authority. Leaders of the PA, who were also the leaders of the PLO, understood that the latter was the source of the legitimacy of the former, so they strove to replace and control what remained, namely its title. EY succeeded to the degree of reducing the PLO into an instrument for the PA to utilize or dispense with as necessary. For example, when Hamas won the Palestinian Legislative Council elections in 2006, the PA revived some of the PLO's institutions as a means to supplant the parliament over which it had just lost control. After Oslo, the PA set about changing official titles without any material effect. A head of the authority, called chairman according to Oslo, became Palestinian president, even though his powers did not change in the slightest. The Authority Council became their legislative council, which now had an increased membership. Israel tolerated these low Y appellations, and why should it not? EY were merely pieces in a game of symbols, a slew of ceremonial titles and emblems used to compensate for what was missing on the ground: sovereignty. Sadly, this culture of compensation through symbols spread from politics into literature, art, LM, and other cultural realms. A form of national narcissism arose to fill the voids in the national reality. Each time Israel was supposed to implement one of the Oslo steps related to the redeployment of Israeli forces pursuant to the Cairo Agreement, 1994, or the Oslo II Accord, 1995, a political storm would break out in Israel. No Israeli prime. 151. Minister wanted to be the one to do the redeploying and hand more areas to the PA as stipulated under the agreements. Naturally, extremist forces did their best to obstruct the process. The indeterminate, hesitant and partial nature of the agreement and the phased arrangement for its implementation, which was intended as a confidence-building measure to test the credibility of both sides, invited attempts to sabotage it. On the 25th February 1994, Only months after the Oslo I Accords were signed, an Israeli sailor and U.S. immigrant named Baruch Goldstein opened on a large congregation of Palestinian Muslim worshippers who had assembled for prayers in the Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron, killing 29 and wounding 125. In retaliation for this massacre, a spate of suicide acts were carried out by Palestinian individuals and members of Islamist militant groups. Arrest of these targeted a bus stop in the city of Afula within the Israeli borders on the 6th of April 1994, killing 8 and injuring YVE. Another 4 more deadly suicide acts by Palestinians took place the same year. On the 4th of November 1995, Prime Minister Rabin was murdered by an Israeli religious nationalist. Shimon Peres, who succeeded him as Prime Minister, tried to play the strongman because he lacked the military prowess that, in Israeli eyes, partially legitimized Rabin's peace with the PLO. Peres escalated their war against terrorism, and the consequence was another wave of suicide bombings in urban centers carried out by Hamas and Islamic Jihad. On the 11th of April 1996, Peres initiated the 16-day Operation Grapes of Wrath against Lebanon, in which Israel launched massive air raids and extensive shelling on southern Lebanon. It killed hundreds of Lebanese civilians, including those who were killed in the shelling of a UN compound at the village of Karnar on the 18th of April 1996. Israeli public mood shared in response, swinging from sympathy with Rabin as a victim of extremism. Shock at the assassination of an elected prime minister and fear of Jewish radical religious nationalists to anger and vengefulness against the Palestinians. Rather than concluding from the failure of a partial peace that a more just peace was required, people in the center of the Israeli political spectrum concluded that moderate Palestinians were either too weak to control their Islamist rivals, or too devious and elusive to be trusted. Netanyahu, who became prime minister on the 18th of June 1996 after Peres lost the elections, tried to avoid ordering redeployment in Hebron. His inaction led to the tunnel uprising on the 25th of September 1996 in protest against the excavations below Al-Aqsa Mosque and to a clash between Palestinian and Israeli security forces. Afterwards, Netanyahu had no choice but to implement deployment in Hebron, which he did in January 1997. The 1996 confrontation was one of the reasons Netanyahu lost the 1999 elections. 152. Ehud Barak succeeded Netanyahu, serving from 1999 to 2001. Ehud Barak, the Prime Minister and ex-Chief of Staff, was in fact a military man of the Special Commando units who committed assassinations with his own hands and believed in power politics with the elitist military mentality of the fast-acting special units that he once led in the army. No sooner did he take office than a political crisis broke out anew. Initially, he banked on peace talks with Syria, but was unsuccessful. With the support of the American diplomat, Dennis Ross, Barak tried to limit Israel's withdrawal from the Golan Heights in such a way that Israel could continue to control the shores of Lake Galilee. He did not order redeployment in the West Bank because he did not trust Arafat, claiming that he wanted to know where all this was heading. Actually, this should have been a Palestinian demand. What Barak wanted was to reach an agreement on the null status issues on Israeli terms before implementing redeployment and other interim period obligations. Under U.S. pressure and with the collaboration of some of Arafat's minions, Arafat was brought to Camp David to negotiate permanent status issues before Israel met its commitments and without a previously worked-out agreement on the principles of negotiation. Arafat knew this was an attempt to force him to accept Israel's terms on the null status issues. 17. Clinton administration made a serious mistake by going along with Barak on this. 2000 Camp David summit proved a debacle, and not just because of the unequal land swaps put on the table. As part of the solution to the permanent status issues, The US administration and Israel tried to arm twist or browbeat Arafat into giving up any right to sovereignty in Jerusalem, and effectively giving up any claim to the 1967 borders. Arafat refused, for which he was met with international censure, especially from their Western world, which considered the Clinton-Barak alliance, i.e., the alliance between the US Democratic Party and the Israeli Labour Party, a moderate one that represented their enlightened camp. Arafat's rebuff of its patronage was not to be tolerated. Ayer Camp David. Now that Arafat dared to say no to Washington, his destiny hinged on his people rallying around him. A second intifada erupted when Ariel Sharon acted out the principle of sovereignty in person. With Barak's go-ahead, he paid an unwelcome visit to Al-Aqsa Mosque, which was unquestionably a deliberately provocative intrusion. Later, the PA and Hamas joined the Intifada, which had been started by members of Fatah's constituency, turning the Intifada into a military confrontation between the forces of the Palestinian people, including security forces, and Israeli forces. At its earliest peak, the Intifada was characterized by the suicide operations of 153 Hamas and Islamic Jihad against Israeli civilians and aid Barak's deployment of the Air Force for the RST time since 1967 in the West Bank. In 2002, Sharon became Prime Minister. Reverting to military force to assert control, he ordered the reoccupation of Palestinian cities, beleaguering Arafat's offices and residence in Ramallah, and ordered the assassination of Arafat in 2004. Arafat paid with his life for supporting resistance against occupation, albeit after it became clear to him what the negotiating process meant: accept US-Israeli dictates or face isolation and siege. A Palestinian leadership that took over the PA faulted Arafat. Isa their takeaways from the Second Intifada: that Arafat had sometimes treated the negotiations as a tactic rather than approaching them strategically, that resistance was a grave mistake, and that negotiations were the only path towards a solution. So when Mahmoud Abbas became PA president, he vowed commitment to negotiations and rejected Arafat's recourse to the Second Intifada. Abbas met with Sharon at the 2005 Sharm el-Sheikh summit, where they agreed to a truce. EPA also agreed with the US to refrain and re-educate, i.e., re-indoctrinate, Palestinian security forces on the principles of counterterrorism and security cooperation with Israel, the occupying power. His project was ultimately American-run and overseen by General Keith Dayton. General William Ward was initially announced as security coordinator of the project to restructure the Palestinian security forces. 18 Abbas worked hard to prove he was not Arafat and that the Israelis could trust him, not only in fighting terrorism, but in all kinds of ways. It was acknowledged by Israel's security apparatus, but it did not convince the Israeli leadership or the Israeli public to accept a just solution. The Israeli public, which was veering more and more to extremist religious nationalism, merely thought, as long as the PA was doing most of the dirty work, why agree to a state now? Why stop settlement expansion? Why not push for annexation? At long last, the Trump-Netanyahu deal gave Abbas his reward. Abbas believes that armed resistance is wrong. Yet, he ignores the glaring fact that his own strategy, that of endless peace negotiations in the Oslo framework, has failed. Sometimes, he seems to gloat about his failures just to annoy those who disagree with him. Palestinian fragmentation has contributed to this PEY. Spitefulness. What does a Palestinian leader who gave the occupying country everything it wanted, only to end himself tricked and his favors unreciprocated, have to be proud of? Mahmoud Abbas is not a traitor or an Israeli agent. The problem is that he genuinely believes what he thinks. However, without a shift to a liberation strategy. 154. His approach may lead to a successor who receives his instructions directly from the occupier. At no point did this Palestinian leadership manage to convince Israel and the US that negotiations had to be based on clear foundations and basic principles to lead to a just and lasting solution. Israel continued to see negotiations as an open-ended political project in which the balance of powers determined the pace and the substance, such as it was. As endless negotiations, held purely for form, dragged on, their peace process was abbreviated to the process. At the same time, the occupying power continued to step up settlement activity and reinforce the reality of Israeli control, while the PA continued to lack any approximation of sovereignty even over densely populated areas that Israel wanted to get rid of for demographic reasons. The Oslo Declaration of Principles and the PA's establishment ushered in an insatiable wave of settlement construction and expansion, which devoured more and more Palestinian land. 19 longest settlement freeze was during the RST Intifada, and that was unavoidable. Only the most radical ideological settlers were ready to live in the midst of a rebelling populace. Ere the PLO became hostage to the occupation, it could no longer resist settlement activity. Whenever critics contested the belief that Oslo would lead to the establishment of a state, PLO leaders defended their support for it with the argument that the agreement was needed to counter the threat that settlement expansion posed to the Palestinian cause. The agreement would at least enforce a freeze on the construction of settlements, they said. During the negotiations, settlement expansion witnessed its most spectacular growth since 1967. EPLO could do nothing to stop it, having excluded the option of resistance as long as it wanted to retain any sort of governmental authority. By the Trump era, withdrawing from the Oslo Accords as a reaction to the Trump-Netanyahu deal was no longer option, strategically or tactically. Israel had long since put paid to the Accords in practice. For Israel, the status quo, or a modified version of it, is an acceptable null status, as long as the PA continues to fulfill its main purpose of protecting Israel's security. EPA, which continues to act as though the Oslo process had not ended, remained in a state of denial. Map 6.1a F. Israeli settlement expansion in the West Bank, 1968 to 2015. 155. Map 6.1b. 156. Map 6.1c. 157. Map 6.1d. 158. Map 6.1e. 159. Map 6.1f. 160. Source adapted from Jotunberger. How many settlers really live in the West Bank, Haaretz, the 15th of June 2017. Accessed at hp://bit.ly/3HUZ on. It was under this PA leadership, as characterized by its takeaways from the Second Intifada, that the drastic split between Hamas and Fatah occurred in 2006. Hamas's victory in Legislative Council elections led to armed clashes in Gaza between forces controlled by the two movements, as discussed in the previous chapter. The intra-Palestinian conflict stemmed from the obligations associated with the Oslo Accords and the security forces that it created. Yet, paradoxically, Hamas was determined to take power using the mechanisms of the Accords it refused to recognize, while simultaneously criticizing the Palestinian president's commitment to them. A confrontation between Hamas and Fatah ended with Hamas gaining the upper hand in Gaza. It created a new predicament for Hamas. It was now the sole leader of a highly populated part of Palestine that was under a blockade. It now had to focus on governance and survival in this context. It was a controversial process that included positive dimensions. Hamas had to build or rebuild institutions, whether semi-regular military institutions or civil service institutions similar to those in the West Bank, only under more difficult. 161. Circumstances. The experience of exercising power and managing the blockade engaged Hamas in political processes more than ever before. Like Fatah in the West Bank, Hamas built up partisan authority and established partisan security forces. With two partisan authorities in two discontinuous geographical areas, the Palestinian people and their case were in major trouble, especially given growing Israeli power and its extreme right-wing Israeli leadership. The Palestinian RI, which led to unprecedentedly disparate and contradictory political leadership strategies, favored the rising power of the Israeli right because of the marginalization of pro-peace discourses. It also brought about the decline in official Palestinian influence regionally and internationally despite a parallel increase in international solidarity with the Palestinian people. Fatah and Hamas poured the majority of their resources into their mutual hostility. Reconciliation. Efforts were in vain, and this failure further reduced the credibility of both factions. And, at a larger level, it tarnished the reputation and image of the Palestinian national movement. Even though both sides recognized how detrimental their split was to the Palestinian people and cause, their desire to retain power and reinforce their own security strength prevailed over higher commitments. When Obama became president, the U.S. administration began to view a complete freeze on settlement building in the West Bank and East Jerusalem as not only desirable, but as a prerequisite for Israeli-Palestinian peace negotiations to advance. But Obama eventually realized there could be no chance of progress as long as Netanyahu was in power, so he gave up and washed his hands of the peace process. Obama probably could have but did not want to exert any pressure on Netanyahu, 21. Whether due to American domestic politics or to foreign policy priorities such as the nuclear deal with Iran, which was already a sufficient source of public tension with Netanyahu. So, Israel continued to expand and intensify settlement activity, leaving the PA stuck with security coordination with Israel and no negotiations. Then came the Trump presidency.